This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on Asian imperialism, Chinese dynasties. So this year we've studied about a number of major Chinese dynasties, and one of the ways to kind of think about them is to think about them as a story. The first Chinese dynasty is the Shang dynasty. They were the founding agricultural dynasty. Eventually, from within, there was a rebellion by the Chu, who rebelled. Now, in order to rebel, they had to form some type of justification, and they did this by establishing the mandate of heaven. Following that time period, there was the War of the States, and in that time period, China fell apart into a civil war. In response to this, to try to solve the problems, the Qin arrived, and they created Chinese legalism, which centralized control under their main emperor and tried to use that as a way to solve all the problems that had arisen during the Civil War. The Qin failed after their major emperor. The nobles rebelled against them, and that led to the Han Dynasty that mixed together Chinese legalism with another school of thought, Confucianism, and that got state Confucianism. During the medieval ages, we saw two major dynasties, actually three, the Tang, Song, and Sui, and they were basically ones that expanded out into neighboring areas. After that, the Mongols conquered China and established the Ming dynasty and ruled that until the Qing, who then ruled until the communists in the 1912. British trade with the Ming and the Qing. The British faced an imbalance of trade due to China's extensive gold from Latin America. Both gold and silver flowed out of Mesoamerica and ended up in China. China then changed their currency not so much towards gold, but towards silver. The problem was China would not buy cotton from Great Britain and in India because their culture used silk. Also, China would not buy tea from Great Britain either. China only allowed the British to trade through the Guangzhou or Canton. In the late 1700s, the British sent Lord Macartney to try to open up China to global free trade, but this failed under Qianlong, the emperor of the Chinese dynasty at that time period. When this failed, Britain began selling opium to China in order to create dependency and force them to open up to trade. One of the leaders within China, a man named Lin Zexu, appealed to Queen Victoria on moral grounds to stop this opium trade, but the British refused and used this as a subtext in order to attack China in two major opium wars. China tried to close its markets to British trade, but would be forced open. The Opium Wars. Queen Victoria claimed that China was barbaric and uncivilized. Why? Because they had closed down to trade. But one of the big things that was forgotten in this discussion was why they were closing down to trade, because of drugs. The British Navy was then used to defeat the Chinese in two major opium wars, and this ended with the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking, China agreed to open up 5 ports, lower tariffs, and pay for damages of the war. The Chinese fight for identity. Within China, after the Opium Wars, there were two major revolutions that took place. One was the Taiping Rebellion. In the Taiping Rebellion, a man named Hong Xiaoquan led a rebellion against the Chinese emperor, and he claimed that he was the brother of Jesus. His complaints and his fellow rebels' complaints included the corruption in the government and higher taxes on peasants. What this demonstrates is the influence of Western Christianity in China, and in fact, the Taiping Rebellion was actually incredibly successful. The Taiping rebellious groups eventually took control of all of northern China. It was only at the last moment when the Qing nobility were able to unite and to conquer the Taiping Rebellion and put it down. But it demonstrates how strong Western Christianity had become within China. On the opposite side, in the late 1800s, was the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion was led by Confucian farmers who rose up against the Chinese government for agreeing to the Western open door policy. The Western open door policy basically split up China into different sections for trade with different European countries. This allowed for European economics and culture to influence internal Chinese belief systems. So the Confucian rebels feared the intrusion of Western culture in their farming China. This demonstrated the attempt to hold on to traditional Chinese Confucian culture. So notice that within China, after the Opium Wars, you have this fight over what future Chinese identity will be. Will it be a Western identity or will it be a traditional Confucian identity? The Chinese leadership fight for identity. Within China, in the midst of this fight, some of the philosophers began advocating for a slogan called East for Essence, West for Practical Use. The main leaders for this were Wang Tao and Zhang Zhidong, who argued for the use of Western technology, but they wanted to retain Confucian beliefs for private and public cultural life. They began creating a movement called the Self-Strengthening Movement. However, the emperor's aunt, the Dowager Zizi, who originally wanted these philosophers to have this discussion, decided she wanted to hold on to Confucian identity and keep out any Western influence. She invited all these reformers to the palace, and then she had them imprisoned or executed. The open door policy. China lost after this period many major battles, including the Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s. This led to their submission to Western powers, especially on trade. They agreed to the open door policy created by the U.S. Secretary of State, John Hay. John Hay advocated for creating trade zones in China to have trade between Europeans and Chinese farmers without having a major world war over Chinese territory. Japan. So we're going to see Japan make a very different decision-making process in how they deal to the outside Western powers. Japan's history really starts off with the Yamato clan, the first family to rule over Japan. Then there was the Fujiwara dynasty, who were a series of rulers who tried to unite the Japanese into one country but never were very successful. After that, the Tokugawa attempted to establish a unity of the country in medieval society in Japan. The way they did this was to have 4 different groups: the emperor, the daimyo, the shogun, and the peasant. The shogunate was created as a military type of leadership to organize all the daimyos, or local governors, in the hopes to unite the Japanese island. The opening up of Japan. But Japan remained rather disunited. In 1853, the U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry forced the Japanese to open up to world trade. He threatened the use of U.S. naval ships against Japan if they refused, and this eventually led to the Treaty of Kanagawa. In this, it established a U.S. consulate in Japan. The result of this was an internal civil war in Japan between the Sat and the Cho. The Sat-Cho civil war erupted between traditionalists who wanted to maintain the traditional Japanese culture as well as Japanese disunity and local control, and reformers who wanted to centralize control. The Meiji Restoration. In the end, the Sat-Cho won, but these traditionalists realized they needed to industrialize to retain Japanese identity. They formed the Meiji dynasty. The reforms included the following: Western education and technology, taxes on farmlands with the incentive for people to move into the cities. Once people moved into the cities, they were given positions in the national government if they were daimyo, bringing them under the authority of the emperor. And the government then invested in private monopolies called zaibatsus. Japanese political parties. As this was happening, there was a fight in Japan for how to then move into the more modern age. And there were a number of different political parties. There was a progressive party that wanted a legislative and executive branch, but with more power to the president. A liberal party that wanted a parliament with democratic government. An imperial party that wanted more power for the emperor in order to expand outwards into Korea and Japan. In the end, there was a mixture. The mixture was of the imperial party with the progressive party. What happened was the emperor got a parliament, but the parliament acted as an advisory group, very much like Chinese legalism. Note that what was happening here was the Chinese slogan, even though this was not China: East for essence, West for practical use. What the Japanese did was to take Western technology and Western education, but to put it into a more Asian type of identity of having a strong emperor with a parliament that was used not as a democratic check and balance, but much more as a group of advisors to uphold the Japanese emperor's identity as a messenger of the gods. Japanese imperialism. So how successful were the Japanese? Well, in 1894, there was a rebellion in Korea, and China and Japan took sides. The Sino-Japanese War erupted, and Japanese easily won due to their steel industrialized navy. In the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China gave up Taiwan and Liaodong Peninsula. Then in 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian Navy and sunk the entire Russian fleet off of Korea. In 1908, the Japanese annexed Korea. In other words, in about a 50-year period, Japan became the dominant power within Southeast Asia and created their own sphere of influence.